peoples of the worldwide federated internet. What's good? Thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining me. As I always say, you could be anywhere doing anything, but you are here joining me on this journey of the thinking. If you've been following me for a while, whether you follow me on my Bible podcast or you follow me on Instagram, my Bible podcast, or anywhere, you know that I've had my questions and my doubts about the results of the election. I don't know what happened, and I never proclaim that I know exactly what happened, and I somehow have some kind of inside information to what happened, but things just didn't seem right. And many times when things don't seem right, that's when you have to sit back and you have to analyze, all right, what's going on? Is it just, am I seeing things that are not there? Is there something I don't understand? Or is there some underlying situation that just doesn't feel right? And I know that something is wrong. Intuition is really a thing. I wouldn't necessarily lean into, the emotionalism of trusting and feelings. But sometimes people just have intuitions about things. There's been people who have avoided some kind of drama or turmoil just because they had an intuition that, something tells me not to go here, not to do that. And when I look at this election, talking about the presidential election of 2020, obviously, something just didn't smell right. Now, to those who don't know, there was a Time magazine article, the title of which is The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. The funny thing about this article, now, there's already been much coverage of this article, so I'm sure all of you have heard all of the different talking points in one way or another. And I'm not really necessarily going to say anything super different. But what I do want to do is I just want to read the whole article. And every now and again, I might stop and have some commentary about something that's said. But I want to do this for several reasons. One, some people are not going to have time to read through a whole article, but they might have time while they're doing something else to listen to a podcast. So I want to read this article, and then you can draw your own conclusion. And of course, I'm going to have some commentary. I'm not just going to leave it dry, but you'll see many things that, in my opinion, point to some of the problems or some of the questions that people had about everything that went on during this election. So here's the Time magazine article. It's called The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. This is a Time magazine article. This is not a conspiracy theory website. So I just want to make that known as we go through this article. All right. A weird thing happened right after the November 3rd election. Nothing. The nation was braced for chaos. Liberal groups had vowed to take the streets, planning hundreds of protests across the country. Right-wing militias were girding for battle. In a poll before Election Day, 75% of Americans voiced concern about violence. Instead, an eerie quiet descended. As President Trump refused to concede, the response was not mass action, but crickets. when media organizations call the race for Joe Biden on November 7th. Here's the funny thing about that. When, as I said, I'm going to offer some commentary. That's why you come here. It's the thinking. These are my thoughts. When President Trump was elected, there was riots. There was people crying and sobbing and much things going on. And the funny thing about this is the media told us for months that if Joe Biden is elected and if President Trump loses, that this is what the right was going to do. Now, you can talk about the Capitol Hill situation. And look, it was stupid. It shouldn't have happened. But I'm not going to sit here and make it seem like this was a common occurrence from people who supported President Trump, because I'm just being honest. It just wasn't. That's not about being partisan one way or another. It just wasn't. So something happened that was crazy and shouldn't have happened, but nothing happened after that. There's no riots across America. As a matter of fact, I don't hear Trump supporters really going too crazy on Biden other than to criticize his policies and to question what he's doing and whether he has America's best interest in mind. Now, you can argue that the left did the same thing against Trump. The difference, however, is that the attacks that were lobbed against Trump were often unmerited, even though there was legitimate reasons to dislike Donald Trump. I've always said that before, but the attacks were always unmerited. It was always attacks based on things that were actually good. So it's like, what Alice in Wonderland are we living in? What upside down world is this? Is this Stranger Things? Are we in the upside down? It appears. Anyway, jubilation broke out instead as people thronged cities across the U.S. to celebrate the democratic process that resulted in Trump's ouster. Funny how they call that a democratic process, but when Trump was elected, it was as though democracy failed. No, democracy didn't fail. People voted for Trump because this is who they wanted as the president. Anyway, I digress. A second odd thing happened amid Trump's attempts to reverse the results. Corporate America turned on him. Hundreds of major business leaders, many of whom had backed Trump's candidacy and supported his policies, called on him to concede. To the president, something felt amiss. And I'm going to interject, rightfully so. Something isn't right. You've been in my corner this whole time. Now, all of a sudden, you're calling on me to concede. What's going on? It was all very, very strange. Now, mind you, this is a New York Times article. This is not a conservative magazine. Trump said on December 2nd, within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. In a way, Trump was right. Let me read that again. In a way, Trump was right. This is Time Magazine. This is an article in Time Magazine. There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes. So everyone who said that it seemed like there was something going on behind the scenes, there was some conspiracy, this article is vindicating that. They're admitting to that. This is the same reason people were scrubbed from social media. One that both curtailed the protests and coordinated the resistance from CEOs. Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. The pact was formalized in a terse, little notice joint statement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and an AFL-CIO published on Election Day. both sides would come to see it as a sort of implicit bargain inspired by the summer's massive, sometimes destructive racial justice protests, in which the forces of labor came together with the forces of capital to keep the peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy. Now, again, I'm going to interject. What it sounds more like is that the mob bullied everyone else into a decision. That's what it sounds like, because it sounds like they were thinking, well, if Trump wins and we get more protests, we definitely don't want that. So let's see to it that he doesn't win. It sounds like bullying to me, but maybe I'm just looking at this too simplistically. The handshake between business and labor was one component of a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election, an extraordinary shadow effort dedicated not to winning the vote, but to ensure it would be free and fair. Now, the wording of this is so suspect. It's like they're trying so hard to say what we all know they're saying without actually saying it. Free and fair, credible, and uncorrupted. For more than a year, a loosely organized coalition of operatives, listen to these words, scrambled to shore up America's institutions as they came under simultaneous attack from a remorseless pandemic and an autocratically inclined president. The words they use, the words they use, it's very. Anyway, I'm just gonna keep reading. Though much of this activity took place on the left, it was separate from the Biden campaign and crossed ideological lines, with crucial contributions by nonpartisan and conservative actors. The scenario, the shadow campaigners. Let me read that again. This is not a conspiracy theory website. This is Time magazine. The scenario, the shadow campaigners who were desperate to stop was not a Trump victory. It was an election so calamitous that no result could be discerned at all. A failure of a central act of democratic self-governance that has been a hallmark of America since its founding. Now, I'm going to interject here, and this may or may not be true. I'm not saying this definitely is, but it sounds like there were people that know they were going to do something that was going to be obvious to the population at large, which would make everybody question the election on all sides, but they wanted a certain outcome, so they were doing everything within their power to make sure people only saw the outcome they wanted. They're even going to admit that further on in this article, which is pretty crazy. Their work touched every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting systems and laws and helped secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. There's many people who supported President Trump that have brought this up. Like, hey, you guys changed laws to favor you. Like, that's not a free and fair election. And they were dismissed. And many people called them conspiracy theorists. Well, this article just said that happened. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits, recruited armies of poll workers, and got millions of people to vote by mail for the first time. Now, I want you to think about everything that was said already in this article and the fact that they said they recruited millions of poll workers. So is it fair to say that it's a possibility that these poll workers were not operating in good faith? They successfully pressured social media companies to take a harder line against disinformation and used data-driven strategies to fight viral smears. Translation: any information that we didn't deem that was correct, we pressured financially social media companies to lean in our direction, and we prevented things from going viral. This doesn't seem organic and it doesn't seem free and fair. Maybe I'm just looking too much into it. But you're hearing this article for yourself so you can make your own determination outside of my opinion. They executed national public awareness campaigns that helped Americans understand how the vote count would unfold over days or weeks, preventing Trump's conspiracy theories. Now, mind you, this article stated by saying this was a conspiracy. You see, and I've gone over this before, a conspiracy theory is nothing more than you looking at some information and coming to the conclusion that it's possible that several parties conspired to do a certain thing. There's nothing crazy about that, right? So there's nothing crazy about conspiracy theories, even though that's the connotation that they're trying to push here. Trump's conspiracy theories and false claims of victory from getting more traction. So they're saying we actively did everything in our power to prevent this from being looked at and getting any traction. After Election Day, they monitored every pressure point to ensure that Trump could not overturn the results of the results. First of all, Trump couldn't just overturn the results. That's not how this works. But if his cases were heard and they were valid and evidence seen and things investigated and it was found that the accusations were true, then the election would have been overturned, but on the merits of legal grounds. The untold story of the election is the thousands of people of both parties who accomplished the triumph of American democracy as at its very foundation. And really, this doesn't really seem like democracy, in my opinion. This seemed like a bunch of elites who had enough power to stop someone from being elected, and they exercised that power. That doesn't sound like democracy. Says Norm Eason, a prominent lawyer and former Obama administration official who recruited Republicans and Democrats to the board of the voter protection program. Doesn't really sound much like voter protection, but just my opinion. For Trump and his allies were running their own campaign to spoil the election. The president spent months insisting that mail ballots were a Democratic plot. They just admitted in this article right before this that it was a Democratic plot. Do you see the mental conundrum here? This article is crazy. And that the election would be rigged. They are literally admitting in this article that they rigged the election. There's a difference between cheating and rigging, which rigging is by definition cheating, but you can rig something to favor you no matter what happens, which is cheating. His henchmen at the state level sought to block their use, while his lawyers brought dozens of superior suits to make it more difficult to vote, an intensification of the GOP's legacy of suppressive tactics. Now, I will stop here and I will say, as a student of politics, I'm not going to call myself a political buff. It would behoove you to look into actual voter suppression. And again, this is not about leaning right or left. It's just about the facts. Throughout history, the Democrats were known for voter suppression tactics. That's a matter of fact that you can look into these things yourself. Before the election, Trump plotted to block a legitimate vote count. And he spent the months following November 3rd, trying to steal the election he'd lost with lawsuits and conspiracy theories. Now, again, they just admitted in the beginning of this article that there was a conspiracy. Now they're trying to make his conspiracy theories seem crazy. Pressure on state and local officials, and finally summoning his army of supporters on January 6th rally that ended in deadly violence at the Capitol. Now, mind you, if you actually go listen to the president's audio, which I believe you can find on Gab from that day, he called for a peaceful protest. He did not call for riots. And again, this is not about whether you support Trump or whether you don't support Trump. It's about the facts that we actually have on hand. That's all this is about. The Democracy campaigners watched with alarm. Every week we felt like we were in a struggle to try to pull off this election, with the country going through a real dangerous moment of unraveling, says former GOP Representative Zach Wamp, a Trump supporter who helped coordinate a bipartisan election protection council. We can look back and say this thing went pretty well, but it was not all clear in September and October that it was going to be the case. So it doesn't, like I said, you can form your own opinions. These are definitely my opinions while I am reading the facts presented in this article. But it seems as though they only wanted a certain outcome. It doesn't seem like they were really concerned with who would actually win. This is the inside story of the conspiracy to save the 2020 election, based on access to the group's inner workings, never before seen documents, and interviews with dozens of those involved from across the political spectrum. It is the story of an unprecedented, creative, and determined campaign whose success also reveals how close the nation came to disaster. Every attempt to interfere with the proper outcome of the election was defeated, says Ian Basin, a co-founder of Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan rule of law advocacy group. But it is massively important for the country to understand that it didn't happen accidentally. The system didn't work magically. Democracy is not self-executing. So they are pretty much admitting this election didn't go Biden's way by accident. We forced it to go Biden's way. Of course, I'm interjecting here, but it is what it is. I see what I see. That's why the participants want the secret history of the 2020 election told, even though it sounds like a paranoid fever dream. A well-funded cabal of... Listen, man, this is a Time magazine article. Let me read that again for you. They're saying this. They're admitting this. A well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. How many of you think that that sounds anything like democracy? That sounds like a group of elites that want something to happen, and they will subvert you and the will of the people to get the outcome that they want. That's what that sounds like to me. Maybe I'm just oversimplifying this. They were not rigging the election. They were fortifying it. And many people who've commented on this article have said the same thing. And I agree with all of them. I'm not saying anything new, and I'm not trying to make it seem like I'm some grand wizard of information, that I'm saying something that nobody else said. But listen to what they said. They were not rigging the election. They were fortifying it. How insane. That is, wow. So change a word and we all good. Change rigging to fortifying. Oh yeah, it's all good now. And they believe the public needs to understand the system's fragility in order to ensure that democracy in America endures. So this is how democracy dies, huh? The Architect. Sometime in fall of 2019, Mike Podhauser became convinced the election was headed for disaster and determined to protect it. How did he know? This was not his usual purview. For nearly a quarter century, Podhauser, senior advisor to the president of the AFL-CIO, the nation's largest union federation, has marshaled the latest tactics and data to help its favored candidate win elections. Did you hear what I just said? The nation's largest union federation has marshaled the latest tactics and data to help its favored candidate win elections. Unassuming and professional, he isn't the sort of hair-gelled political strategist who shows up on cable news among Democratic insiders. He is known as the wizard behind some of the biggest advances in political technology in recent decades. A group of liberal strategists he brought together in early 2000s led to the creation of the Analyst Institute, a secretive firm that applies scientific methods to political campaigns. He was also involved in the founding of Catalyst, the flagship progressive data company. None of this sounds like it's on the up and up to me. Maybe it sounds like that to you. Maybe I'm just different. I don't know. The endless chatter in Washington about political strategy, Podhauser believes he has little to do with how change really gets made. My basic take on politics is that it's all pretty obvious if you don't overthink it or shallow the prevailing frameworks whole. He once wrote, "After that, just relentlessly identify your assumptions and challenge them." Podhauser applies that approach to everything. When he coached his own adult son's little league team in the DC suburbs, he trained the boys not to swing at most pitches, a tactic that infuriated both their and their opponents' parents, but won the team a series of championships. Smart dude. Might be up to some nefarious stuff, but he is a very smart dude. Trump's election in 2016 credited in part to his unusual strength among the sort of blue-collar white voters who once dominated the AFL-CIO, prompted Podhauser to question his assumptions about voter behavior. So what it sounds like is they had a voting base that went the other direction. They were upset about it, and they were going to do everything in their power to rein you plebes back in place. He began circulating weekly number-crunching memos to a small circle of allies and hosting strategy sessions in DC, but when he began to worry about the election itself, he didn't want to seem paranoid. It was only after months of research that he introduced his concerns in a newsletter in October 2019. The usual tools of data analytics and polling would not be sufficient in a situation where the president himself was trying to disrupt the election, he wrote. Most of our planning takes us through election day, he noted, but we are not prepared for the two most likely outcomes, Trump losing and refusing to concede. The Trump winning. Now remember, Hillary Clinton said specifically, and many on the left said, under no uncertain terms should Joe Biden concede at all if he lost. And Trump winning the Electoral College, despite losing the popular vote, by corrupting the voting process in key states. Notice what they said. Remember, they're the ones that admitted they changed the rules. They changed the rule. It's almost like everything they're blaming Trump for is what they are actually doing. And now they're throwing it right in our face. We desperately need to systematically red team this election so that we can anticipate and plan for the worst we know will be coming our way. If for those of you who are not in the IT environment, you may not be familiar with red team, blue team. It has to do with infiltrating a network and protecting against that infiltration. Anyway, that's something you could look up at another time. Interesting stuff. It turned out Podhauser wasn't the only one thinking in the terms he began to hear from others eager to join forces. The Fight Back Table, a coalition of resistance organizations, had begun scenario planning around the potential for contested election, gathering liberal activists at local and national level into what they call the Democracy Defense Coalition. Voting rights and civil rights organizations were raising alarms. A group of former elected officials was researching emergency powers they feared Trump might exploit. Protect Democracy was assembling a bipartisan election crisis task force. It turned out that once you said it out loud, people agreed, Podhauser says, and it started building momentum. He spent months pondering scenarios and talking to experts. It wasn't hard to find liberals who saw Trump as a dangerous dictator, but Podhauser, here's the funny thing, a dictator wouldn't exit. Just gonna throw that out there. Podhauser was careful to steer clear of hysteria. What he wanted to know was not how American democracy was dying, but how it might be kept alive. The chief difference between the U.S. and countries that lost their grip on democracy, he concluded, was that America's decentralized election system couldn't be rigged in one foul swoop. That presented an opportunity to shore it up. In my opinion, this is just my opinion. In this article, I get the sense that whatever they're telling you, they did the exact opposite, right? So, for instance, when he said the chief difference between the U.S. and countries that lost their grip on democracy, he concluded, was that America's decentralized election system couldn't be rigged in one foul swoop. That presented an opportunity for them to shore it up. In my opinion, that presented them the opportunity they needed to rig the election, change rules, get activist groups, do this, do that. And we're seeing that, right? He just admitted it couldn't be done in one fell swoop. So you had to have a multi-pronged approach, which is exactly what they did to ensure the outcome they wanted. Man, right in our face, they're doing and saying all of this. On March 3rd, Podhauser drafted a 3-page confidential memo titled Threats to the 2020 Election. Trump has made it clear that this will not be a fair election and that he will reject anything but his own re-election as fake and rigged. And that's not exactly what Trump said, not even close, as a matter of fact. He wrote, on November 3rd, should the media report otherwise, he will use the right-wing information system. Now, and that's odd because really the left controls academia. They control 98% of the media. So what is he talking about? The right-wing information system to establish his narrative and inch his supporters to protest. The memo led out 4 categories of challenges: attacks on voters, attacks on election administration, attacks on Trump political opponents, and efforts to reverse the results of the election. Then COVID-19 erupted. At the height of the primary election season, normal methods of voting were no longer safe for voters or the mostly elderly volunteers who normally staff polling places. Here's what's funny. throughout this whole pandemic, and I've said this, throughout the whole pandemic, you had people going to grocery stores shopping. Nobody stopped that. Yeah, anyway, but political disagreements intensified by Trump's crusade against mail voting prevented some states from making it easier to vote absentee and for jurisdictions to count those votes in a timely manner. Chaos ensued. Ohio shut down in-person voting for its primary, leading to minuscule turnout. A poll worker shortage in Milwaukee, where Wisconsin's heavily Democratic black population is concentrated, left just 5 opening poll places, down from 182. In New York, vote counting took more than a month. You see, in my opinion, this is where they pull on the race card and they yank on that card a lot. Suddenly, the potential for a November meltdown was obvious. In his apartment in the DC suburbs, Podhauser began working from his laptop at his kitchen table, holding back-to-back Zoom meetings for hours a day with his network of contacts across the progressive universe, the labor movement, the institutional left, the Planned Parenthood and green space resistance groups like Indivisible and Move On, progressive data geeks and strategists, representatives of donors and foundations, state level grassroots organizers, racial justice activists, and others. In April, Podhauser began hosting a weekly 2.5-hour Zoom. It was structured around a series of rapid fire 5-minute presentations on everything from which ads were working to messaging to legal strategy. The innovation only gathering soon attracted hundreds, creating a rare shared base of knowledge for the fractious progressive movement. At the risk of talking trash about the left, there's not a lot of good information sharing, says Annette Schenker Osario, a close Podhauser friend whose poll-tested messaging guidance shaped the group's approach. There's a lot of not invented here syndrome where people won't consider a good idea if they didn't come up with it. The meetings became the galactic center for constellation of operatives. Just thought I'd stop on that word. Across the left, who shared overlapping goals but didn't usually work in concert. The group had no name, no leaders, no hierarchy, but it kept the disparate actors in sync. Again, and I've said this before, the easiest way to rig this election was to have a group that had no central figure, so you couldn't point back to one person. And they're pretty much telling you that's exactly what they did. And I've been saying and thinking this for months. Pod played a critical behind-the-scenes role in keeping different pieces of the movement's infrastructure in communication and aligned, says Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. You have the litigation space, the organizational, the organizing space, the political people just focused on the W, and their strategies aren't always aligned. He allowed the ecosystem to work together. Now, again, on its face, there's nothing wrong with wanting a candidate to win. And there's nothing wrong with campaigning, putting out advertisements and all those such things toward that person winning. But when you change the rules, when you change laws to favor your candidate, when you steer information away from the other candidate and you have the apparatus to do that, yeah, this doesn't sound like democracy. It sounds like rigging, not fortifying. Protecting the election would require an effort of unprecedented scale. As 2020 progressed, it stretched to Congress, Silicon Valley, the nation's state house. It drew energy from summer's racial justice protests, many of whose leaders were a key part of the Liberal Alliance, and eventually it reached across the aisle into the world of Trump skeptical Republicans appalled by his attacks on democracy. What attacks, though? He said mean things. Anyway, securing the vote. The first task of overhauling America's bulky election infrastructure in the middle of a pandemic for thousands of local, mostly nonpartisan officials who administer elections, the most urgent need was money. They needed protective equipment like masks, gloves, and hand sanitizers. They needed to pay for postcards letting people know they could vote absentee, or in some states, to mail ballots to every voter. They needed additional staff and scanners to process ballots. Now, I don't know about you, but I thought this and ballots and all of that was handled federally. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what's being said here, but it doesn't sound like it's on the up and up. In March, activists appealed to Congress to steer COVID relief money to the election administration led by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. More than 150 organizations signed a letter to every member of Congress seeking $2 billion in election funding. It was somewhat successful. The CARES Act, passed later that month, contained $400 million in grants to state election administrators, but the next tranche of relief funding didn't add to that number. It wasn't going to be enough. Private philanthropy stepped into the breach. An assortment of foundations contributed tens of millions in election administration funding. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative chipped in $300 million. It was a failure at the federal level that 2,500 local election officials were forced to apply for philanthropic grants to fill their needs, says Amber McReynolds, a former Denver election official whose heads the nonpartisan National Vote at Home Institute. I love when they throw in nonpartisan when you kind of get the inclination that that's actually far from the truth. But anyway, I digress. McReynolds' 2-year-old organization became a clearinghouse for a nation struggling to adapt. The Institute gave secretaries of state from both parties technical advice on everything from which vendors to use, on how to locate drop boxes. Local officials are the most trusted source of election information, but a few can afford a press secretary, so the Institute distributed communications toolkits. In a presentation to Podhauser's group, McReynolds detailed the importance of absentee ballots for shortening lines at polling places and preventing an election crisis, and noticed that all of the people that leaned heavily or just leaned completely to one candidate are controlling everything going on behind the scenes with the election. You don't find that problematic? Definitely problematic. The Institute work helped 37 states and DC bolster mail voting, but it wouldn't be worth much if people didn't take advantage. Part of the challenge was logistical. Each state has different rules for when and how ballots should be requested and returned. The Voter Participation Center, which in a normal year would have supported local groups deploying canvassers door to door to get out the vote, instead conducted focus groups in April and May to find out what would get people to vote by mail. In August and September, it sent ballot applications to 15 million people in key states, 4.6 million of whom returned them. In mailings and digital ads, the group urged people not to wait for election day. All work we have done for 17 years was built for this moment of bringing democracy to people's doorsteps, says Tom Lopak, the center's CEO. Boy, it's an interesting article. I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing. I'm probably going to stop about right here and then offer some commentary because this would be too long if I try to read the whole thing. The effort had to overcome heightened skepticism in some communities, and many black voters preferred to exercise their franchise in person or didn't trust the mail. National civil rights groups worked with local organizations to get the word out that this was the best way to ensure one's vote was counted. In Philadelphia, for example, advocates distributed voting safety kits containing mask and sanitizer and informational brochures. We had to get the message out that this is safe, reliable, and you can trust it, says Hannah Fried of All Voting is Local. I will put the link to this article in the description of this video. This is something you should probably go read. You should probably read the whole article because, again, this is not a conspiracy theory website. This is not InfoWars. This is Time Magazine admitting what most people thought about this election going into it. Pretty much, in my opinion, what this article displays and shows is they were working behind the scenes well before the election, their own words, to ensure the proper outcome. So the assumption is, even though they're not saying, the assumption is that Trump winning wasn't the proper outcome. The proper outcome of any election is whoever wins. That's the proper outcome, not who you think should win. And that's what this article is pointing to. This article is, the mind-boggling thing about this article is they are admitting what everybody thought and what they banned people across many social media spaces for saying. This is nuts. Read the article for yourself. Make your own determination. Y'all know what it is. Stay frosty, people.